Okay, so this is part of the Exodus series. So, in the Exodus series, a panel of, I guess, biblical scholars from different theological perspectives, different faith traditions, they get together and they have dialogues among themselves about certain things. I will premise this video that I have not seen it. Second, I will say that I have heard clips from this, and I want to be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of panels. The reason is I would rather you just learn straight out what the Catholic view on things are and just leave it at that. I'm not really interested in what Protestantism has to bring to the table because the best that Protestantism has to offer is what's Catholic. So I already have that. And I'm not really interested in what other religions that who reject the incarnation of Christ have to say because I don't think they're working with the fullness of revelation. So I, I'm not really interested in their insights per se because there's more that they could be working with by which they can come up with insights. So it doesn't really interest me. So this particular series has not at all appealed to me. I haven't watched much of it. Occasionally, when certain things are said, like when, oh, what's his name? It was a conversation talking about pornography, and Dennis Prager made some sort of comment about, yeah, it was Prager. And later on, Matt Fradd had invited Prager on to his show to have a dialogue about pornography. And he was talking about how it's a behavioralist religion, the Jews are, and that it doesn't matter, that there's no way you can commit adultery there. I'm not going to rehash that. I didn't really have a video about that. I thought Matt's video was so sufficient. There's absolutely nothing I could really add to it. But I did have a hard time with Prager in this. But anyway, so we're going to watch the video. And when we do, this is once again new. I have not seen this. So let me get the volume right.
Those God's self-description in verses 19 where he talks about, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. That's plainly an echo. I think Ben said this in the last episode of Exodus 3:14. But as it were, it's not as if the reason that there's a shift here is from what's happened in chapter 32. It's the golden calf. It's God.
Golden calf. That's right. Yeah. What would you have to add? Oh yeah, I like Prager. He's a conservative. I have a lot that I can say that he has done with PragerU and people he's worked with and everything. Absolutely, this was just a comment that he made that was that he had made on in the context of this forum that was way off from what the Catholic position was, and so it was something that was certainly of interest to me to examine. Oh yeah, I understand the depth. That there were certain things that you felt like they were speaking beyond your capacity to understand what they may have been getting at. So I'll listen.
I think we said in the previous episode that God's self-description in verses 19 where he talks about, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. That's plainly an echo. I think Ben said this in the last episode of Exodus 3:14. But as it were, it's not as if the reason that there's a shift here is from what's happened in chapter 32. It's the golden calf. It's God showing mercy on the Israelites after their sin, and it's not.
So it sounds like this is after in the Old Testament. So Moses goes up to the mountain to talk with God, and the Israelites do this really weird thing. And what they do is they take all of their jewelry and they melt it down and they make this golden calf. And Aaron says, "This is the God." He looks at the calf and says, "This is the God right here. This thing, this golden calf, is what led you out of Egypt." All right, this is the Exodus out of Egypt and past the Red Sea into the desert. They get to Mount Sinai. Moses is up there. He's hanging out there for a really super long time. And all of a sudden, they craft with their hands this golden calf and they start worshiping it. Yeah, they were out in the desert for about a full generation. And they start worshiping this calf. And it was just really super weird. Like, this calf? So unfortunately, they were starting to commit idolatry. They were already violating what Moses was receiving on the mountain, which was to have no other gods before me, to have no idols of anything in the sea or in the air or among the animals. So here you have this calf, this golden calf that they have crafted with their own hands. This is the God. This is the God who brought you up out of Egypt. Where Moses burned the false idol and made them eat the ashes. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So Moses comes down and he like throws down the tablets and breaks them, which is a very symbolic gesture of them of breaking the commandments. And and Moses actually ended up like burning and melting down the idol and turned it into like a dust and made all the people consume the golden calf, which was I mean, he does things. It's a very interesting to watch. No, not after 40 years. They were in the desert for about 40 years. So they left Egypt. They were in the desert for about a generation. 40 years is kind of like a generation. So they were in a generation. Most people, a lot of people who were died and who were there ended up dying, and they weren't going to enter into the promised land. And so even Moses himself, because of his own sin, wasn't going to be able to enter the promised land. That was through Joshua when they entered over the Jordan River, and then their first conquest there at the Jericho. Jericho, I think, was the first city that they encountered entering into the promised land, and Moses wasn't with them at all at this point. No, you're not slowing down at all. You love that false idol so much. You're going to eat that then. All of you. It's absolutely fun. There are things in Scripture that, despite the fact that the context is quite sad, it strikes us as incredibly humorous that this would be a thing. But yes, he goes up to the top of the mountain, and it's said that God himself, by his finger, wrote out the commandments on the stones. And so when Moses went down, he threw down the stones, they broke, and then Moses made a duplicate of the stones, chiseling it out with his own hand, and then those are the tablets that end up being in the Ark of the Covenant, not the ones that God used his fingers, so to speak. But I'm perfectly fine with the jokes. It's funny. I think we were all the reason for the breaking of the tablets. It kind of, what's kind of interesting about the breaking of the tablets, it always reminds me of this scene, and I haven't seen it all, but the Monty Python Ten Commandments, I think it was, where Moses stands there and he's got 3 tablets. He's like, I bring you 15, and then one falls and breaks, and he's like, 10 commandments. As if uh, as if there were more, and then he's like, oh no, I don't remember what those were. So I bring you 15, 10, which is kind of interesting, because if you actually end up reading through the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament, if you were to count out the number of imperatives, there are more than 10. And so there are actually different numbering traditions as to what the 10 Commandments are. And so I believe the Catholic numbering comes from Augustine. So the first 3 have to do with God, whereas the have no other gods before me, have no idols, are wrapped up into a single commandment. Whereas the 9 and 10 are broken up into 2, where do not covet your neighbor's goods as one, and then do not covet your neighbor's wife as a second one. The Protestants decided that they were going to number these differently. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what the reason for this numbering difference is, but they break up the have no other gods before me, have no idols, into 2, and then they take the 9th and the 10th, and they bring those together, and so you end up with the final commandment being have no other, do not covet thy neighbor's goods and wife, all into a single one. And so some people get that confused, right? Yes, this is absolutely true. Yeah, all of our gaming contributions will never be lost on the world. People can lie to themselves, they can lie to others, but they can never change reality. And that's the thing. They can never change reality for what it is. They can never rewrite history, no matter what they say. 4 is still 4, no matter who's in charge, right? And God knows all that, and we know all that, so everything's good.
We've talked a little bit about, does God change? How can he be the same? How can he be in relationship?
This is a very interesting question in theology in general, because according to Catholic theology, philosophically, God is divine simplicity. He is purus actus. He's pure act. All right, I'm trying to remember the exact Latin for it, but he's pure act. What that means is God is pure actuality. There's no potentiality in God that has yet to be actualized, which is really interesting, because what this means is that God doesn't change. He can't change, right? There is no way for this to occur within God. God absolutely cannot change. There's no potentiality, because as soon as you propose that there's potentiality in God, he can no longer fulfill the definitions philosophically for a necessary being. And so people have asked the question, well, how can this really cold and rigid philosophical idea, how can you have a relationship with that? Why does that make any sense? Like when you read in the Old Testament where these dialogues between Abraham and God are taking place, and God's like, no, I won't do it if this, and I'll do it if that, and if there are 10 or 15 in the city, I won't destroy it, and so on and so forth. It almost makes it sound like that Abraham's changing God's mind, but in the end God ends up destroying Sodom and Gomorrah anyways. And so nothing was really changed. It had more to do with Abraham being changed through the dialogue, that everything was going to be destroyed, and everything did end up being destroyed. It just had to do with him coming to understand that a city could be destroyed for so few, because of so few. it didn't matter how many righteous that they may be in the city, that the city was so bad, God had already determined that he was going to deal with it. There's also issues of so-called counterfactuals where God made some sort of comment, or Christ made a comment, God and Christ, of course, that if the miracles that were performed before you were done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes, which was, of course, to shame the people he was actively talking to. And obviously, the time of Christ and his miracles was not to occur until later, so those things actually could not have occurred in the past. But this idea that there was something that could have been done where there would have been a different result. But once again, it wasn't time for the time of Christ yet, and that sounds like that may have been the only thing. So there's these so-called counterfactuals. God certainly knows those contingencies and everything else, but it's very interesting. So God being pure being and unchanging is something Aquinas argues on in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1. Oh, does he? Okay. Good for him. I think this is important. It's really weird for God to be anything other than unchanging, because then, like I said, it's the same thing. He would have to have potentiality, and that means he has the potential to change for the better or for the good. And if he's changing for the good, that means he's presently not perfect, and therefore he's not a necessary being. And if he changes for the worse, well, he's not a necessary being, because necessary beings can't do that. So it just keeps going back to God is actus purus. He's pure actuality. And Aquinas is a very brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. Did this great thing in retro, and Messi did too, and blah 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 blah. Found something too. Name can't be mentioned until he's. People do things, One thing I like to tell people: I may have the world record today, I may have the world record tomorrow, I may not have it 10 years from now. But the one thing you absolutely cannot take from me is what is historically objective. The contributions I made. You absolutely can just pretend. You can lie. You can create a false narrative. You can do all these really weird things. But all you're going to do to yourself is place yourself at odds with reality. And at that point, you're just doing that to yourself, folks. You're absolutely doing that to yourself. You're idiots. God bless you. Oh wow. You're going to need God's blessings. Yeah.
And still not change. I think it's a very subtle way of understanding that this is not God changing. It's not God's personality changing. It's, as it were, our relation to God, our understanding of God is progressively, God is progressively revealed to us through the changes, through the actions and the decisions that we undertake. And I think it's a very important point. It preserves God's immutability, maybe his impassibility, his freedom from suffering, but it also explains how we can, as it were, enter into relationship with him.
Well, that's
Yeah, the relationship is one of conformity. We enter into relationship with God in his own terms, not on our own. That's important. So, like when God becomes incarnate, nothing changes. Nothing changes. The divine nature is intact. Nothing changes about the divine nature in the incarnation. Some people will think, well, this is God acting in time and space. He must therefore be changing. He must be doing something different because he wasn't doing this before. But it's maintained in the doctrine of the hypostatic union that nothing is changed about the divine nature. And so what we learn from that is that the incarnation itself ends up revealing something to us about God himself, which is very beautiful.
The concept of prayer, which is very difficult to understand on sort of the raw childish level, which is God is gumball machine, right? You put in your quarter and the gumball comes out. The idea of prayer that you're talking about is obviously a lot more meaningful, because it's really not about changing God's mind, it's about changing who you are, and thus God naturally responds to you differently because you're not the person that you were before you prayed.
Okay, so this was a sound clip that was used by the Daily Wire to promote Exodus. So every now and then what they do is they take a little sound clip at different intervals, and they'll play that on their shows, and they would recommend this particular panel discussion. Exodus, it's called. If you become you pay for Daily Wire Plus, which at one time I did. That's how I have the leftist tears tumbler, hot or cold. Because at one point I did. It was pay for 1 year, get the second year free. The best deal that they ever had. But at this point, I basically get all my content from YouTube. So if it's not free, I don't see it. I don't have endless amounts of money to be able to support the Daily Wire as much as I want to support everybody I want to support. There's people outside of the Daily Wire I want to support, and I just can't do that beyond the fact that I'm going to listen and be impacted by what they say, and that's the effect. That's my payment. But this particular idea that he's talking about right here, about prayer doesn't change God. Now, someone might think, and I know this has been brought up before, if somebody dies, their trajectory is fixed. If they're heaven bound, our prayers could be helpful to them. If they're not heaven bound, our prayers are of no avail. Our prayers for the dead don't change their destiny. That's not the point of our prayers. The point has to do with having a hopeful expectation that God is more gracious than we might think that he is, and that he might be willing to extend grace and mercy to people in their ignorance and everything else. I know this goes back to the whole Father Barron thing, Bishop Barron thing about hopeful universalism, that we can we can't believe that all are going to be saved. We can't think that all are going to be saved. We can't expect all are going to be saved. But we can pray, "Oh my Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven, especially those in most need of thy mercy. Amen." So that last part, lead all souls to heaven, especially those in most need of thy mercy, such a beautiful prayer that encompasses the living and the dead. We express a kind of hopeful, I don't want to say expectation, but we are placing things into the mercy of God. And whatever God does is going to be just. So we will, when we get to heaven and we see how everything's filtered out, we see the sheep and the goats, we see how everything pans out, we will be perfectly satisfied with the outcome, because justice will prevail. And so there isn't going to be cases where somehow God has mercy on somebody who absolutely doesn't deserve it, and this, that, and everything else. And God's going to have mercy on whom he has a mercy, and he's going to harden those whom he's going to harden. But don't think that there's some sort of arbitrary divine sovereignty that just simply decides, "Now you're going to hell. You all right, fine, yeah, well, whatever. You're going to come over here." To the exclusion of any reason. He's the divine reason of the universe. He's the thread that holds all existence together. We will be perfectly satisfied with God's judgment on all things. Right? But until those things are revealed, we certainly ought to be gracious in our desire to pray for people and so on and so forth. I think that's a good thing. So I think it's much better to have that kind of hope, because there's been people who would say, oh, I knew this person all the way up to the point of their death. I just knew this person. There's no possible way they're going to heaven. There's just this person was just absolutely bad, this, that, and everything else. And I think to myself, unless you were severely angry and bitter towards this person, you wouldn't want to hope such a fate upon them. Here's the thing. There's a lot of people who deserve hell. I deserve death and hell, okay? There's a lot of people who deserve hell. But the thing is I wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemy. That's eternal, conscious torment. All right. I would not wish that upon my worst enemy. I hope everybody the best. I want to help people to recognize there are better choices, there are better options. God loves you. He wants to transform you. He wants to purify you and cleanse you by the blood of the cross, and he wants to bring you home. And I really hope that means more people than less. Yeah. Well, I could say one thing. While it's not completely clear exactly what the new heaven and new earth will look like, the fact that there's going to be a new earth may mean that God might recreate pets that we may have had. I don't dismiss that possibility. I mean, often there are depictions of lion laying with the lamb and so on and so forth, and some have portrayed this as being something that will be fulfilled much further in the future, that we will not be living altogether in the way in which we are living now. So I grant that this certainly could be a thing, that God can recreate the exact matter that made up a pet that we loved. I don't dismiss that as a possibility in the new heavens and new earth. I just can't say for certain. I don't know if that's going to be the case. All I know is that you'll be pleased with it, and it'll be sufficient to lead you to ultimate happiness. And if that does or does not involve certain emotional attachments that we have had at certain points, we will actually be okay with it, because there would be compensation for what you may think that you're losing. I think we'll be completely fulfilled. So
I mean, the verb to pray in Hebrew is actually in the reflexive tense, right? Lahit palel, right? Which is supposed to, the idea is that it's supposed to be something that acts on you. The prayer is supposed to act on you. It's not supposed to be something where you're attempting to pry an answer out of God.
So this idea then comes down to that prayer is something that changes me. It's not meant to change God's mind. It's not meant, because ultimately there is going to be that which is best for me. I don't always know what that is. I don't always have that insight. Sometimes I kind of feel like I'm in an ant farm, and God is like this guy who likes to study ants, and he knows exactly what I need and exactly when I need it. And it's not always going to be what in any particular moment I might perceive it to be. God may be orchestrating something that I can't even see on the other side of the wall, but it's going to be much better for me. So That certainly is not going to be something that's going to change. God's not going to change what's not going to change is the thing that he wants to do in my own life won't change. But what will change is my soul will be molded as in humility, I enter into prayer. Now, some people will say, well, I believe in God. Yeah, well, how's your prayer life? Oh, I never pray. Reveals to you that while the concept might be somewhat comforting to people, the soul has not yet really conformed itself to a state of humility of you are God and I am not. And that's why I enter into this dialogue of supplication. Lord, I need this. I need your help. I need your guidance. I need your wisdom and discernment, understanding, and knowledge. I need your help. And the acclamation of God, you have done such wondrous things before I even existed. You had me in mind. You created the entire cosmos. This whole thing. It's absolutely wonderful and beautiful and just beyond wonder. And so we enter into this kind of humility about our state and about who God is and who we are in relation to him. And when we actually reflect and speak from that kind of disposition, we make ourselves very vulnerable. We place ourselves at the feet of the cross. Lord, I need your mercy. I need your Holy Spirit to lead me into holiness. And so all of that stuff does in fact change the disposition of the individual. God is so holy and awesome and perfect and good and true and beautiful and all this other stuff. Believe me, you're not going to find a moment where you're not going to be changed by this. And God is so awesome, he doesn't have to change because he's already the pinnacle of beauty. He's already truth. He's already goodness. Nothing has to change about him for us to adore him and be changed by him.
Actually, one of my favorite, kind of dark headlines from The Onion is God answers prayers of paralyzed little boy, no, says God. Right, like which is obviously incredibly dark and terrible, but also true, meaning like God does say no, but the idea is...
There is a lot of suffering in our world, and sometimes people think, well, God couldn't possibly be loving. He couldn't possibly care for us if we cry out to him in our paralysis or some other ailment that God's not relieving our suffering. How could he actually care for us? It's because God understands that suffering, if you use it well, if you use that well, you will have a greater capacity for beauty and love and peace and everything else at the end of it. But the thing is, you might not like the suffering. You might not like what it gets in the way with some temporary good that you think that you're going to get. God is not going to heal you if some greater good is going to come about it. If some greater good is going to come about it, you absolutely will not receive a healing. That's just not going to happen. So that's the way you have to kind of conceptualize this. Is if you're undergoing some sort of suffering, some sort of trial or hardship, you have to understand that God in his permissive will has allowed this because he knows that some greater good is going to be coming out of it. And that's going to be better for you in the long run. In the scheme of eternity, that's going to be better for you. You may temporarily be quite distraught, but the thing is that you don't use it well. Understanding the doctrine of redemptive suffering. If you don't understand that God allows us to suffer so that we can be shaped and molded through these trials and tribulations. So, that's why James says, consider it pure joy when God allows such things. Because God has, in a sense, granted to you the potential of reaching a greater virtue that somebody would not have been able to without said suffering, right? And I know we're only at the 2-minute mark on this video, but I need to take a quick break. So it'll be quiet. It'll be quiet. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. Why doesn't God answer all prayers? Okay, fine. I'll be right back. All right, here we go. I don't know what you're saying there, Savage. What did Ben do? Yeah, we all need more, don't we? Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in more.
Is that the person he's saying no to might be a different person than the person he says yes to tomorrow, because you change yourself in order to be the person who deserves a different response from God.
And maybe
That's an interesting thing, too, in terms of there's a passage that says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In fact, along those lines, there's another passage that talks about that we may have asked God for something, but we may not have asked rightly, because we may have the intention to using what God may give us for ill intention, right? And so that certainly is the case as well. God knows whether or not something that He's going to give to us is going to be good for us or not. So if we ask for something and God says yes, we get the thing, it's probably because it's for our best overall. And likewise, if He says no to something, we don't get it, it's probably because it's better for us overall, right? Yeah, so okay, that's fine. That's fair enough.
that's the whole message of the construction of the tabernacle, that it's not something that, as it were, God does to the people of, to the Israelites. It's not sort of God acting through miracles or even through revelation. That the revelation is an enabling condition of that, but it's what the Israelites undertake together. It's what they do together
to be able to receive
that ultimately transforms them into the people that God's called them to be.
Well, I think it certainly seems to me to be a productive way to consider prayer, and I really do believe that our capacity to think, and I'm thinking about this as an evolutionary biologist, actually emerged out of the domain of prayer, because thought seems to me to have a prayer-like structure. The first is, I have a problem that I need to solve. So that's like an admission of insufficiency. And the next is, the answer could make itself manifest. Now you might say, well, I'll think it up, but that's a pretty sad explanation. It's more like, no, you admit you have a problem, and then you open yourself up to a revelation. And then the revelation makes itself manifest. The thought appears. And it's often, especially if it's a deep thought and a deep new thought, it strikes you as a surprise, right? It's not like you predicted it. It springs itself on you as if it's something new. And
Well, thinking and thanking are etymologically related.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I want to return to Moses' role for a moment. Douglas?
It's an interesting conversation for somewhere. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I don't know. I try to reserve my thoughts. I try not to come to too many conclusions about people per se. All I do know is I have a tendency to gravitate towards Catholic conservatives. And so I don't listen to Ben all the time. I'm more interested than, say, I'm listening to Michael Knowles. I watch everything that has to do with Michael Knowles. All of his shows, all of his talks, all of his side projects. Just anytime he talks, I'm listening. And that has made a really big difference in my mind when it comes to political philosophy and how Catholicism kind of relates to the ideas of freedom and everything else. Outside of Knowles, I may dabble a little bit, not too much. I don't have a lot of time, to be quite honest. I do listen to Liz Wheeler a lot. She's also a Catholic conservative. So I do find myself gravitating towards Catholic conservative political commentators, and then I just kind of loosely listen. I try not to judge what they're saying too much. I just kind of listen and then, gather information, and I don't necessarily just absorb everything that's being said, but at the same time, because we can share opinions on things and there's share thoughts. We might come from different angles on that. But I think ultimately that some of the conclusions are ultimately the same on some of these things. I do remember, for example, like Knowles, for example, did this reflection on a video of this kid, maybe it was during the Little League or something, he got hit by a pitch and he got walked to first base, and the pitcher was visibly distraught that he had struck somebody with their pitch. And the person on the other team on first base walked over, gave the pitcher a hug, and then walked back. And I can tell you that from a perspective of a parent who watches my son play games against other people, against other children, I can say that I kind of liked what took place there. I thought that was incredibly neat. That ultimately, yes, we're at each other's throat in the midst of the game, but at the same time, there's the human element that's involved, and I think it was a nice gesture for the opponent to say, hey, listen, I forgive you. You can move on. You can continue doing your best. We deserve to play against your best, and if this is getting in the way of that, just let you know. So I mean, I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking about the way that like Knowles is thinking about it, and he's criticizing it, and I'm like, I'm not completely on board with the string of argumentation that he's doing right there. But at the same time, I'm like, so what? I mean, he can have his thoughts about that particular Little League interaction, and I can have my thoughts about it. It's whatever. I mean, I think the difference is ultimately is that his children are still extremely young, and they're not playing sports yet. Whereas I think my oldest is in high school, so I do see him interacting with people, and good sportsmanship is certainly a good component. You know, I think that's quite important. So with all of that said, you know, I listen. That doesn't mean I absorb everything. Doesn't mean that I just mindlessly adopt all of his views about absolutely everything. But I listen, and I do find most of the time when it comes to when he starts talking about political philosophy, when he starts talking about the freedom, what freedom means, when he starts talking about virtue versus vice and things like that, I can get on board with those things in general because he's applying Catholic principles to political situations. And so I'm perfectly fine with assessing things from that perspective. It does, like I said, I'm not going to agree with every single thing that flows from his mouth as if he's the mouthpiece of God. But like I said, when it comes to the philosophy and the application of Catholic doctrine and so on and so forth, it piques my interest. I'm going to listen in a little bit more because I don't know as much about political philosophy, and I've learned quite a bit from Knowles. And so I do tend to get my news from like Michael Knowles or Liz Wheeler, and anyone who might be looking at it from a conservative or a Catholic conservative perspective. Who's I like those two. I've been like the last week. I've those are the ones I've been listening to. I know there's tons and tons and tons of people. Don't get me wrong. There's tons of people that I have listened to over the years that my time is very limited. So I've honestly have had to just choose. If I listen to nobody else, who would be the top person to listen to? And that's Michael Knowles. If I were to listen to a second person, would it be like Matt Walsh or would it be Liz Wheeler because they're Catholic conservatives? I would gravitate towards those more so than I would others. I don't have time for the Tim Pools. I don't have time for necessarily Ben Shapiro. I do have time for maybe one or two shows per day, and that's about it. Like when I'm commuting in my car, I don't have the luxury of just watching absolutely everything out there, and so I completely understand that. I choose great people. That's good. That's good to hear. The most human thought I've ever thought is it's humanity versus Mother Nature, and all we can do is try to break event. What's that mean? Humanity versus give Tim Pool it was. I did watch that video with Tim Pool. When I was sent the video, I was actually thankful because I had no idea that Michael Knowles was on the Tim Pool show. That's not something that shows up on his YouTube or the YAF, the Young American Foundation's website for where he does his conversations. But when he talks about like a debate, I might find that debate somewhere. I would not have known that he was on the Tim Pool show unless you had shared that with me, and I'm glad that I did because I kind of thought the conversation was quite interesting, even though I thought Ian was kind of off in left field a little bit. He's nice. Yeah. Okay, so. Let me. We haven't even got past the 9-minute video here, so let me do a little bit more.
I was asked a question yesterday, and I want to amend the answer that I gave because you were asking about Moses as not being perhaps sufficiently defined, and I went to the archetypal or the assimilating ego, let's say, where he's mediating between the id of the golden calf and the superego that's God. But I think that gives.
What was he talking about? Sigmund Freud stuff for? See, this is one of the reasons why I have a tendency to not like panels. You know, I'm not interested in Sigmund Freud. I'm not interested in the id, the ego, superhero, ego, and all of that stuff. You know, I am not at all interested in looking at scripture through the lens of Sigmund Freud. So this is why I don't spend time listening to any of these. Yeah, I get it. I'm literally playing like 3 seconds and I'm talking for 10 minutes. I do apologize, but at the same time, it's we still need to work through this book. All right, we've spent 3 chapters, I think, in this book. Well, we did the introduction, then we did the first 2 chapters. I need to reread them and then start back at chapter 3. I actually had somebody make a this one by Father Brian Mulady. Thomas Aquinas Rescues Modern Psychology. He talks about Sigmund Freud and stuff in this, but it's mainly focusing on Thomas Aquinas. It's something that I tend to get back to. I had a comment. So somebody actually decided to make a comment on one of my videos and wondered if I had finished the entirety of the book. I do intend to finish the entirety of the book. I find Brian Mulady, he's a Dominican priest. He's very insightful. He could be difficult to understand. I've tried taking a class from him twice and failed twice. I can say that it's because the depth is there, and I think that's a good reason to fail a class, is that I have no idea what this guy is saying. Yeah, I know what you're saying, but we will revisit it. Like I said, I won't recap what the book has said so far, but I will reread the introduction, the first and second chapter, and then start doing the videos again, reading and commenting upon, starting with chapter 3. I do plan on continuing with that. So for those who are interested in that video series, I think I did a playlist on YouTube that isolates what I've done out of that book so far. There are certain things in Aristotle I wasn't quite understanding, and that had to do with the vegetative and the animal aspect of the soul of humanity, particularly because those things are physical. And I've generally have thought of the soul as something as like merely immaterial. So I'm not quite sure what Aquinas is saying there. I want to revisit that before we proceed any further.
Gives him short shrift. And so in contemporary narrative, where we have that aha moment, the sixth sense, the usual suspects, it's where
The Sixth Sense, come on, man.
the mythic meets the particular, where it's 1 second ahead of you, but it's immediately graspable. You're just talking about that a little bit. And with Moses, one of the things I was thinking about is it's evident for me very much with Jesus. There's a number of moments where I'm about my Father's business, right? It's the shocking moment, but then immediately you sort of grasp what that means, right? Why hast thou forsaken me? Like, forgive them, they know not what they do.
He's trying to say way too much in such a short period of time. It's not even clear what his point is.
But I think I think it's short shrift to consider Moses more archetypal, like as a rough draft for Jesus, because the more that we're reading this and spending time in this, there's a lot more that's emerging for me that I hadn't thought before this discussion. That is the specific and is the particular. Show me thy glory. When he asks for his name to be blotted out of the books, there's out of God's book. And so there are these traits, I think, that three-dimensionalize him more than my initial answer of tacking to the archetypal or the Western.
He's almost talking as if somehow he learned something through this conversation with these other people from these different backgrounds, and maybe I'm narrow-minded, but I'm of the impression that I have nothing to learn from non-Catholics. I know that sounds very egotistical. I know that sounds very narrow-minded, but at the same time, I have a tendency to believe that the fullness of truth has something to offer me that's greater and better than somebody who doesn't have the fullness of truth. It makes me believe that there isn't anything I have to learn outside of Catholicism, because Catholicism already has the fullness of truth. Why do I have to go to somebody who is non-Catholic for an insight on something? I know that people would probably disagree with what I just said, but for some reason I don't believe that me as a Catholic needs to go outside of Catholic dogma, that I need to go outside of the Code of Canon Law, that I have to go outside of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that I have to go outside the interpretation of Scripture through the Apostolic Six tradition, that everything that God had intended for me through Apostolic tradition comes to me through the Catholic Church. Now, this isn't to say that, and now I will amend what I just said, that doesn't mean that there's something that's not outside of Catholic tradition, that there is something I can learn, like physics, or, I mean, there's all kinds of things that I can learn that are, say, outside of dogma, that are outside of the church, because the church only deals with things that have to do with faith and morals. Okay, the church doesn't dictate what is and is not scientific, for example. So I can learn things that isn't in Scripture, that's not part of faith and morals, but not part of the tradition. But you're going to rest assured that anything that comes to me is going to be understood within the context of it. And so it's going to be it's not going to be something that ultimately I believe adds to, as if the thing outside will give me greater insight into the faith and morals that the church teaches. Something outside of faith and morals is going to inform me so that I can come to know faith and morals better than what the Catholic Church already teaches on the point. Right, I had to amend mid-sentence here, mid-thought rather, to avoid the kind of idea that there's nothing to be learned from other disciplines and so on and so forth. But the thing is, I'm also responding in a sense to this guy. He didn't start off really well using the language and the concepts of Freud, so I'm already just wall, right? Filters on. Take it with a grain of salt. I mean, he's all over the place. I don't know, what his main point is, and I think maybe that's the point with some of this kind of stuff. There's so much ambiguity about. They think they're being so insightful, but they're literally saying nothing at all. I've listened to this guy for 30 seconds. I've learned absolutely nothing, and it's just frustrating. It's like he sounds smart, but he's dumb.
Got courage, he's got curiosity, he's got an opening to all no matter the cost, right? Striving and seeking. There's a whole number of modes of his engagement that I think are a lot more robust than I initially led with.
If I can just say something about that particularity, there's a sense...
Did he say anything? Is there anything to be gleaned from that?
When you talk about the veil, God veiling himself, that one could read that as, God's not wanting to show you all of himself, you're not allowed to see it all. But I think, in a way, that's a mistake. I mean, this is more about the way in which things can actually happen in this mediated sense. Jonathan's saying, you don't feed a baby with a fire hose of milk. You don't when you're cold coming in from the snow or whatever, you don't warm yourself up with a blowtorch. You don't teach a calculus to a 2-year-old. And I think this is related to what I see as the profound.
Yeah, I am perfectly fine with what he's starting with. I don't know what he's leading to, but there is certainly the biblical conception of spiritual milk leading to meat and so on and so forth. I mean, it kind of makes sense. When it comes to growing in the spiritual life, it can be incredibly difficult. I'm still asking questions. I'm still having to dive into, say, the saints and the doctors of the church, and reflect upon their own spiritual journeys, to reflect on how they thought about God and the everyday kind of life. And that's always going to be part of our journeys. And I think gleaning from the wisdom of the saints is what we need to do. We need to understand what it means to be purged of our sin, what it means to conform ourselves to Christ. What does it mean to receive God's revelation in a way that is unchanging, but yet also illuminates where I am at in my own life, and where I can enter into union with God in a way that my will becomes more perfectly in line with his own will. And so there's so much that I just said that it can be expounded upon in the purgative, illuminative, and the unitive way of the spiritual journey, the three ways, so to speak, that are elaborated on by the saints, that speak to us so much wisdom about their own journeys. It's kind of always interesting to learn from people who have lived holier lives than I probably ever will. And so there is a sense in which the dogma of the Catholic Church is great, it's intellectual, but where the rubber meets the road is where it actually transforms and changes the way that I live my life and how I relate to God and to others. And that makes a lot of difference. But I think that is the most difficult aspect of it all. I'm very good at studying ideas, but at the same time, I've always been very poor at the execution of a holy life. We still talking about Freud there? Yeah, I mean, I don't mind reflecting upon the idea of psychological pain, confusion, and trying to understand our past experiences and trauma, and all of that stuff makes sense. You know, we need to think about the behaviors that we have as a result of our past, and we have to address the unresolved emotions and sometimes the impact that trauma can have upon us. And I think those are good things to reflect upon, because I do think there are aspects to understanding the soul, which is the study of the soul, which is what psychology is supposed to be to be, right? And so we reflect upon how these different things impact the way that we live our life and the way that we come to God, even, and the things that he has allowed. And, you know, like, God, why would you allow this suffering? Why would you allow this trauma? Why would you allow this confusion and this really dark time in my life where I was just overwhelmed by emotion and overran by irrationality, and I just I don't know why I had to go through such difficulties, you know. You know, and I've always enjoyed psychology ever since I was in my studies. That there's always been, but I've never really been interested in like Freud and B.F. Skinner and all these other people who came to the table with this naturalistic idea that we are our brain. We are only our brain, I should say. We are only our brain, and it's more deterministic, and it's rooted in a philosophy that is incorrect. Now, of course, I'm pretty sure that when we get back into this will be even more apparent, right? And yes, I do believe that there's even some psychological lessons that can be drawn from Scripture. I think, and I think that that's one thing that Peterson, I think, can help to bring to the table is that he's. I mean, yes, I think he's more into the sociology, but he certainly can bring up things that are very true. You know, I mean, and that's fine. But yeah, for me, I'm certainly not interested in the pharmaceutical industrial complex. I'm quite weary of pharmaceuticals. I would prefer to try to find some sort of natural remedy first, particularly because antipsychotics and antidepressants can often hinder the normal emotional process that a person actually goes through. And I've been more of the school of thought that I need to be able to emote freely. I need to be able to experience these things without the manipulation of chemicals in my brain that could actually hinder that particular process. That doesn't mean that I'm against the use of pharmaceuticals. I mean, I know some people, not personally, but I know that there are people who struggle with hallucinations, and medications actually end up helping them and stuff like that. So don't get me wrong, I'm not anti science when it comes to what are some therapeutics or ways that we could potentially help people. I'm just saying that people can be overly diagnosed and people can be overly medicated, and I think those things are bad, right? That's not science. No. What I mean by science is the idea that if somebody is struggling with, right, yeah, if they found out a drug, an antipsychotic, actually has helped, like Haldol. For some reason, Haldol comes to mind. I'm not even endorsing Haldol. I'm just saying that it's something that has been subscribed to people who have experienced kind of psychotic episodes, hallucinations, stuff like that. It's an antipsychotic. I mean, I don't think that it would be used at all if there hadn't been at least some sort of track record or some sort of results oriented study that shows that that it has had some good therapeutic help to it. Anyway, so
tenderness in this passage. There's something so beautiful, and it shall come to pass while my glory passes by, thou put thee in the cleft or cleft of the rock, and I pass by thee. And there's that sense of the Almighty, sovereign, sort of infinite, that could destroy you in a flash, making Himself such that you can hear and see. And this reminds me very much of the.
This brings two things to mind. One is the idea of, yeah, we're all nuts here. The condescension of God. Okay, so the idea, at least philosophically, is God's infinite, right? We're finite. So how can the infinite explain itself to the finite? One analogy, which analogies are helpful to some extent, but they also break off and lead to heresy if you maintain them too strictly. And that's the idea. If God could become an ant, right? Or if a human being could become an ant, we might be able to explain something of human nature to an ant. And this, I think, was proposed by C.S. Lewis in talking about when God became man, that something of God could be communicated to man. Now, granted, it's we're not ants, and how could you communicate something of human nature to an ant? But at the same time, we're asking the question, how can you define something that's infinite to the finite? But I think obviously the difference between the two is that we actually have an intellect. We were created in the image and likeness of God. the likeness of God, that gives us the capacity to be able to conceptualize a great deal about God without necessarily circumspecting his nature as a whole. That is, to come to know him as he knows himself, which we never will. But it's a very beautiful way of thinking that God, in a sense, condescends himself to some extent, that we can come to know something about him, even though that we cannot really speak of things that we know and of God univocally. I've talked about this before. We speak of God looking at things, and we do this analogically by way of analogy. We can say that God is like this, or God's not like that, and where we can say something in the affirmative or by way of negation, and so on and so forth, that we can come to know things about God. And slowly but surely we come to grasp certain rational, intellectual depictions of God in philosophy and so on and so forth. Yeah, you can ask a question. And so if God's going to reveal anything to us at all, it's certainly going to be in bits and pieces. And some people say, well, God is hidden, God doesn't reveal everything. And it's like, well, I think there are certain things about God that maybe he just can't reveal, right? Do I think God will ever show to anyone what he is? All caps. Do you think God will ever show to anyone what he is? Beyond whatever the Catholic Church thinks and concerns about the... no, I don't think we will ever have the capacity to see God as he sees himself. I think that would require an infinite divine intellect, which we don't have. Even after death, we still have a finite intellect. Now, the idea is, all right, when we see God face to face, this isn't... I speak of this sometimes in terms of a finality, in terms of that the end goal of our intellect is to perceive the good, the true, and the beautiful, and it finds itself at rest when we behold. It's not a stupid question at all. Beauty itself, goodness itself, truth itself. And so we're seeing this. And the idea is that there isn't a finality to that. All right, because we're seeing God, but it's not the end of seeing God. And I think that for all eternity, our grasp of God will continue to grow. We will continue to grasp beauty in new ways. We'll continue to grasp truth in new ways, and goodness in new ways, so that, like I said, we don't have a divine intellect, so we can't perceive ourselves, or we can't perceive God as he sees himself. So there's always going to be growth, infinite growth, as the finite relates to the infinite. There's always going to be infinite growth in God. So we're not going to be bored. So when I speak of our intellect being at peace, being seeing God face to face, like we're not seeing the entirety, right? All right. So Captain says Aquinas would say no. You think we wouldn't fully understand God in heaven? Correct. Either as fully understand Him, you would have to be the same as Him. Correct. Yes. Okay. I see what you're saying. So you're responding to Savage there. So that's good. Heaven will get a better idea than on earth. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, but generally the idea is that we'll be at peace. Our intellect will be at rest in a sense that it is finally perceiving the thing that it wants to perceive the most. And as such, will continue to grow in that, which is quite beautiful, really, right? The Space Odyssey, yeah, as an entire summary of the. You didn't create yourselves. What? Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, the isn't that the movie where it shows like the monkey using the bone and hitting things, and the music cues in. Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually seen all of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I think I recall that scene for some reason, and that scene is attached to that idea, right? But yeah, it's just the idea that humanity kind of evolved from monkeys. And I'm not saying that there isn't the body of Adam didn't result from something like that. I leave that question open, so don't crucify me on that. The Catholic Church doesn't fully define all that. So, but nor do I think that. Let me see. And the end, it shows an egg with a baby in space, which represents aliens made us. Oh, I'm trying to think. So Star Trek does this. Earth was so-called seeded by an advanced civilization. They also seeded the Klingons and the Vulcans and the humans, and we also see this, and to try to remember the film. Ben Stein did a video where he was evaluating the philosophy of intelligent design, I think it was, and at the end of the film he interviews Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins talks about the absurdity of God. I can't believe that you would say such a thing, but he does talk about our planet maybe being seeded by aliens as a potential origin of life. Yeah, there's the monkey with the giant rectangle and a random space baby with no context. That doesn't sound like it would amuse me all that much, to be quite honest. I have a tendency to be very judgmental, but at the same time, I find that fascinating.
The language at certain parts in the New Testament, the hairs of thy head are numbered, and how care for you like the sparrows of the field and the lilies of the valley. The sense, this.
He's talking about divine providence, right? So when you hear the word providence, just think of the word provide, right? Divine providence, the God provides for the flow or the unfolding of things, and sovereignty usually has to do with ultimately whatever God wills and what he permits is going to be the case. So when I think of divine providence, I'm thinking that God is providing. He knows all the hairs on our head. He provides the fields and provides for the animals and so on and so forth.
Sense that which is highest not only knows us, but makes itself such that with a tenderness we can hear and see and feel and live that.
Well, now,
Yeah, not just to live that, but know that that nature's God, all right, nature reveals to us some things about nature's God, doesn't it? I know some people will point out, look at the natural evils, look at the wasp that lays eggs and caterpillars, and the wasp eggs eats the caterpillar, and how can that be God, and this, that, and everything else. And we look at these sort of things, and we it's quite beautiful, really, how nature works. Yeah, I know it seems like nature is always trying to kill us, which is kind of interesting. But nature does what nature does, right? And God allows nature to do what nature does under most cases, except for when maybe he intervenes with, like, say, the Eucharist and transubstantiation, and a miracle here and there, and we may see some supernatural causes with angels and demons and the Holy Spirit and everything. But normatively, though, it seems like the flow of nature continues to be what it is because God made it to be creative and participates in creativity and so on and so forth, which is nice. He knows all of the games in your collection. Yes. He knows when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows you've been bad or good. Oh my goodness, that's Santa Claus. He knows what's to bring me. Yeah, I've always, people ask me sometimes, why are you, what are your thoughts about Santa Claus? And I think to myself, I actually think that telling kids that about Santa Claus is probably a bad idea. I think it could be like culturally fun and this and that, but I also worry that we're telling our children, right? Yeah, you're right. I'm fine with like telling them stories about Saint Nick and the Catholic school that we send them to do talk about that and everything. But I'm talking about the concept that he's like all knowing and he assesses your moral fortitude, and he somehow sees all things, and he's in this place with these little ones who are doing things. And I just can't help to notice that if we're going to be telling our kids things like that, they have so many parallels to God and the angels and stuff like that, it might be bothersome to some people to believed in Santa Claus for so long. It's like a false god, right? And then have them raise the question, well, what other things you've told me are wrong? Or what other concepts of an all-seeing, all-knowing, moral arbiter that I can't see that you have lied to me about? And I'm like, well, I mean, obviously Santa Claus doesn't have very good rational demonstrations on his behalf, but God does, and we can talk about that. But I just find that maybe it plants a seed too deep that one can't trust one's parents, or can't trust ideas of a being who has those kinds of attributes, because those are some of the attributes that God himself has. So I think I would be more inclined to talk to children about God than I would. But yes, God is spirit.
I would also say, again, that's believable if you can think about it very practically. If God is the great animating spirit of mankind at minimum, how would that make itself manifest moment to moment? It would be in the same veiled manner that a very strong man would make himself available to wrestling with a child. It's like you don't unleash your full force, you veil. You only release the amount of force that's necessary in precise proportion to keep the game going. Exactly.
Yeah, that's nice for anyone who's actually been a father and have wrestled their own son in the middle of the living room floor. You have to recognize that there is a certain amount of restraint. What's kind of interesting is I applied once to become a martial arts teacher for children, and I was doing some techniques with somebody that was there that was in the military, who was applying and being evaluated. I didn't get the job, but we were doing some throws and whatnot, and he said, "You're holding back." And I said, well, yeah, I think, generally in this context, when we train, we don't give 100%. We may give, 50 or 70%. But at the same time, I've learned a kind of restraint working with people because, I've wrestled my kids, and you have to be loose enough that they are competing with you, but strong enough where you control the flow of what's going on, that you're not going to lose. And so to become a professional child wrestler, that's funny. Be like, yeah, I applied once. It's funny. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I totally get what he's saying. So you never thought that Santa Claus was all knowing? You figured he was just his elves were spying. I see.
Exactly that. And so it's very realistic that is part and parcel of the structure of being.
And it's amazing how much changes in life. You can be depressed or overwhelmed or, sad. If you step into thinking, this actual circumstance right now, is God loving me? If I can make the move to think, the move is kind of move of faith, to think that these terms right here and now, not sometime in the future, not after all these things change, not after I get my act together, but right now and here, providence, you might say, the highest in what is most determining in all of reality itself is conspiring right here and now to love me. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that changing your perspective of who you are. The fact that you are loved that much. Here now in this moment, it kind of reminds me of the story of the Velveteen Rabbit, right? Under the influence of such love, how can you but become more real in a sense, right? Got a funny story. Patrick Stewart, his father, was a monster of a man. Oh, was he? Even in his 70s, he could throw his son like a rag doll, and with what happened to Picard, I like this. What? Oh, what are you talking about? That Picard's father was really strong. Yeah, I when it comes to Star Trek, I'm willing to give a 1-season try. I watched Discovery for a season. I was like, nope, never watching Discovery ever again. I watched Picard season 1. I said, nope, I'm never watching Picard ever again. Just sorry, I'm just not going to do it. I watched season 1 of Strange New Worlds. I was more open to that, although there were some things in there that I thought was like, no, I wish they wouldn't have done that. I might give season 2 a try, but who knows if they'll even do anything with it. But yeah, Picard, no. Discovery, no. These people are ruining Star Trek.
Rough one. Well,
I love bringing this back to freedom, because when Ben introduced the idea of Tzimtzum, however you pronounce it, as I understand it, God is everywhere, but with a limitation, not the human heart. And that's...
It depends on what he means by that, because God is everywhere, including the human heart. But the real question has to do with what you mean by human heart. I'm thinking of an organ here. Even in relation to the soul, there's the question of, whether or not God's active, or that his activity is influencing you for change and so on and so forth. But ontologically, yeah, I mean, he's certainly there in spirit. I mean, he's permeates everything.
It's the origin of freedom, and you have this idea in the Bible of the primacy of the heart, and that things flow from there. And I love that idea, the limitation.
He didn't talk long enough for me to even get anything out of what he was talking about. But your dad was an original Star Trek fan? He only cares about the original show and movies? I'm not a Trekkie myself, though, or a Star Wars guy. Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, I watched the original series. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I was more of a Next Generation kind of viewer. But I mean, I did like I watched through Deep Space Nine again recently, and I mean, it's nice when you can watch through a series a second time. Yeah, there were some good episodes in there. I'm fine with that. But yeah, I'm definitely a Next Generation kind of person. But I've watched all of Enterprise, all of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Next Generation. Yeah, I basically watched them all except for the new stuff coming out. I don't care for it much.
notion that God has to limit himself to allow for free choice, that is the ultimate act of love, is allowing somebody who you love to make choices, and those choices are not going to go
with your kids.
It's the most difficult thing.
This is an interesting thing when it comes to, is there a kind of divine limiting that takes place so that the free will acts of men could actually be genuine and authentic? And I don't believe so. I don't think that God has somehow in some way limited himself. He's as control of himself as he's always has been. So I'm not quite sure. I know that some people think that, and God creating something outside of himself, this was the divine risk. He could have lost control and this, that, and everything else. God doesn't know what's going to happen, and the free will theistic perspective of Clark Pinnock, for example. No, I reject those kinds of notions.
I mean, as a young parent with 3 kids and a 4th on the way at this point, it is the hardest thing. And one of the hardest things for me is I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she is doing her math homework, and I can see that she's working on a multiplication problem. In the middle of the problem, I can see she's doing it wrong, right? And you can step in and you can tell her she's doing it wrong, and you can correct her, or you can let her go through the entire process and discover for herself that she's doing it wrong, and go back and learn how to correct herself and actually make herself stronger at math.
Yeah, I mean, I think God does that to ourselves, does that to us at times. So, all right, that was a very fascinating video that ended up taking up most of our time. And nobody told me that I was like hiding behind the video so nobody can see me. All right, normally I try to like be over here. So, oh no. I think some of you were appreciative that I was obscuring my face, but yeah, this video is recommended by Savage. If you guys ever have videos or ideas that can prompt discussion, Q&As don't always have to. No, I didn't. I didn't know. I was too busy thinking. I was, like whatever. Q&As aren't always super active. I don't always have 50 people in here in a chat that's just going like this. So oftentimes having some sort of video, some sort of prompt, some sort of list of questions before I go live can really shape and mold what could be a very fruitful, 2 or 3 hours kind of reflection. So in this case, this is kind of interesting. I'm not even sure what I'll name this video when it gets uploaded to YouTube, but thanks for hanging out, everybody. I do got to get going. Probably gonna go and watch a movie or just hang out with the wife and prepare myself to get some good sleep tonight so I can do my my final shift at my present work, and hope that God has something right around the corner, because I can't work on fumes forever. I actually need some resources. So have a great night, everybody. God bless, and we will see you again.